At some point today, probably more than once, you felt it. That particular restlessness. The inability to settle into what you were doing, the pull towards something else, anything else. The vague dissatisfaction with the present moment that makes you reach for your phone, change the channel, get up from your desk, or simply stare at the ceiling and feel like something is wrong. Most people treat this feeling as a problem to be solved as quickly as possible. Modern life has made it extraordinarily easy to solve it. Your phone contains an essentially infinite supply of stimulation, available at the tap of a screen, capable of eliminating boredom within seconds. And so most people do eliminate it, immediately, reflexively, without thinking about it. The boredom arrives, the phone appears, the boredom vanishes. What if that's exactly backwards? What if boredom isn't the problem, but the signal that points you towards something important? What if the restlessness you feel and immediately suppress is one of the most meaningful pieces of information your brain generates, and you've been silencing it before you can hear what it's trying to say? The science of boredom is one of the most unexpectedly rich fields in modern psychology. Researchers studying it have found that boredom is not simply the absence of stimulation. It is an active psychological state with a specific function, a measurable neurological signature, and profound consequences for creativity, self-knowledge, motivation, and meaning. And the near-universal modern practice of immediately eliminating boredom with digital distraction may be one of the most psychologically costly habits in human history. To understand what boredom actually is, you have to start by distinguishing it from something it's often confused with. Boredom is not the same as relaxation. When you're genuinely relaxed, you are in a low arousal state that feels pleasant. Your nervous system has downshifted into something restorative. You're not seeking anything. You're satisfied with stillness. Boredom is the opposite of that. Boredom is a high arousal state of dissatisfaction. The person experiencing boredom is not content with the present moment. They are actively seeking engagement, meaning, or stimulation that they cannot find. The restlessness of boredom is the signal of that seeking. It's uncomfortable precisely because it's trying to motivate something. This distinction was formalized in research by psychologists John Eastwood, Alexandra Frischen, Mark Fenske, and Daniel Smilek, who published a defining paper in 2012 describing boredom as the aversive experience of wanting but being unable to engage in satisfying activity. Notice what this definition contains. Wanting, not apathy, not passivity. Boredom is fundamentally about desire, about the self actively reaching for something meaningful and not finding it. This reframe is important because it changes what boredom is telling you. If boredom is desire without an object, then boredom is your mind informing you that it needs meaningful engagement, that it requires depth, challenge, or purpose that the current situation isn't providing. The discomfort of boredom is the signal of that need, in exactly the same way that hunger is the signal of the body's need for food. Hunger is not a problem. Hunger is information. The same may be true of boredom. Now here is where the neuroscience gets genuinely interesting. When you are doing nothing in particular, when you are not actively focused on any specific task, your brain doesn't actually go quiet. Quite the opposite. Neuroscientists have identified what they call the default mode network, a set of brain regions that becomes highly active precisely when you are not focused on external tasks. This network, which includes parts of the prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the medial temporal lobes, is associated with some of the most sophisticated cognitive processes humans perform: self-referential thinking, the integration of past experience with present circumstances, imagining the future, perspective taking, and what researchers call mental simulation, the ability to model complex scenarios that haven't happened yet. In other words, your brain's resting state is not rest at all. It is a particular kind of deep processing, and the conditions that activate it are precisely the conditions that boredom creates. low external demand, reduced sensory input, the absence of a specific task absorbing your attention. Here is what this means. When you allow yourself to be bored, when you sit with the discomfort of understimulation rather than immediately eliminating it, you are activating the default mode network. You are giving your brain the conditions it needs for integration, for synthesis, for the kind of far-ranging associative thinking that produces insight, creativity, and self-understanding. When you immediately replace boredom with digital stimulation, you shut that process down before it has a chance to produce anything. You are, in neurological terms, interrupting one of your brain's most sophisticated operating modes to read someone else's opinion about a television show. The relationship between boredom and creativity has been studied directly, and the findings are striking. A 2014 study by Sandi Mann and Rebekah Cadman at the University of Central Lancashire found that participants who were given a boring task before a creative task performed significantly better on the creative task than those who weren't bored first. The bored participants generated more creative ideas, and importantly, more unusual and unexpected ideas, precisely the kind that are hardest to produce through deliberate effort alone. The researchers' hypothesis was that boredom activates daydreaming, and daydreaming activates the default mode network's capacity for divergent thinking, the ability to make unexpected connections across disparate domains. You cannot force this kind of thinking. You can only create the conditions in which it spontaneously arises. And one of those conditions, perhaps the most reliable one, is unstructured mental space, the space that boredom creates when you don't immediately fill it. This has implications that most people don't take seriously enough. The creative breakthroughs that appear to come from nowhere, the solution that arrives in the shower, the idea that surfaces during a long walk, the unexpected connection that occurs to you just as you're falling asleep, these are not accidents. They are the output of the default mode network doing its work in the conditions you've given it. They arise when external demands are low, when you're not consuming anyone else's content, when your mind has room to range freely across its accumulated experiences and begin making connections that deliberate focus never would have found. Albert Einstein famously liked to sail, not because he was particularly athletic, but because sailing combined just enough low-level task engagement to keep him present with enough mental freedom to let his mind wander where it needed to go. Nikola Tesla described his best ideas as arriving during states of mental vacancy that he deliberately cultivated. Charles Darwin took long, solitary walks every day, not for exercise but for thinking, specifically because the mild physical engagement cleared his foreground attention and allowed deeper cognitive processes to run. These people were not accidentally stumbling into idle time. They were deliberately creating the conditions that their best thinking required. What modern life has done is make those conditions almost impossible to access by accident. Every idle moment is now an invitation to reach for a device. Every gap in stimulation is immediately filled. And the consequence is that the creative and integrative cognitive processes that depend on unstructured mental space are being systematically denied the conditions they need to operate. But boredom isn't only about creativity. It also functions as a signal about meaning and direction, and this may be its most important function of all. Researchers studying existential boredom, a deeper and more persistent form of the experience, have found that it often arises precisely when a person's current life is misaligned with their actual values, needs, or desires. The person who feels persistently bored in their job is not necessarily experiencing a deficiency of stimulation. They may be experiencing a signal that the work lacks meaningful connection to what they genuinely care about. The person who feels chronically bored in relationships is not simply understimulated. They may be experiencing a signal that the relationship lacks the depth or authenticity they need. The teenager who seems bored by almost everything may not be lazy. They may be in a period of profound self-uncertainty, looking for what genuinely matters to them and not yet finding it. In this sense, boredom functions as a compass. It points away from what isn't working. The discomfort it generates is functional. It's designed to motivate a search. But the search it's meant to motivate is not a search for the next distraction. It's a search for what would genuinely engage, for what would actually matter, for what is actually missing. This is why immediately eliminating boredom with digital stimulation is so potentially costly. Not because distraction is always wrong, but because the signal that boredom is sending may be important, and suppressing it before it can be heard means losing access to information about your own life that you might genuinely need. Consider what happens when you resist the impulse to immediately fill boredom, when you sit with the restlessness rather than suppressing it. The initial discomfort doesn't disappear quickly. This is worth acknowledging. Boredom is genuinely unpleasant, and the modern world has calibrated us to have extremely low tolerance for it. But if you can sit with it a little longer, something usually shifts. The mind, deprived of external content, turns inward. Thoughts arise that weren't there a moment before. Memories surface. Connections form. Questions emerge that are genuinely yours, not prompted by anything you've read or seen or consumed, but generated from somewhere inside. These moments of unprompted self-reflection are vanishingly rare in contemporary life. The average person in a developed country spends multiple hours per day consuming digital content. The conditions for genuine self-reflective thought, the quiet, the reduced external input, the unstructured space, are systematically absent from most people's days. And the cost of that absence is something that is very hard to measure precisely because the thing that's missing is precisely the self-knowledge that would allow you to recognize it was missing. There is a philosopher named Blaise Pascal who wrote in the 17th century that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. It was an overstatement, but it pointed at something real. The person who cannot be alone with their own mind, who must always fill the silence with external stimulation, is someone who cannot fully encounter themselves. And the person who cannot fully encounter themselves cannot develop the self-knowledge that a genuinely well-directed life requires. Modern research has provided empirical support for this intuition. Studies on self-reflection and metacognition have consistently found that people who regularly engage in undirected thought, who allow their minds to wander without immediately redirecting the wandering toward external content, have higher levels of self-awareness, better ability to regulate their emotions, greater clarity about their values and priorities, and higher scores on measures of psychological well-being. The capacity for productive mind wandering, for sitting comfortably in the presence of one's own thoughts, is not a trivial skill. It appears to be one of the foundations of psychological health. There is another dimension of boredom that research has revealed, and it concerns what researchers call the meaning-making function. When nothing external is demanding your attention, the brain tends to turn toward what psychologists call autobiographical reasoning, the process of constructing a coherent narrative of who you are, where you've been, and where you're going. This process requires exactly the conditions that boredom creates. It needs mental space, reduced external input, and the kind of open-ended associative thinking that deliberate focused attention doesn't produce. Many people report that their most important insights about their own lives, their clearest understanding of what they want and who they are, arrive not during periods of active effort or intense engagement, but during exactly the kind of idle, understimulated moments that most people label as boredom and immediately try to eliminate. Long drives, waiting rooms, shower thoughts, the edge of sleep. These are not coincidentally the moments when the autobiographical reasoning process has the conditions it needs to do its work. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor whose book Man's Search for Meaning influenced millions, described what he called the existential vacuum, the experience of profound meaninglessness that results when people lack clear values and purposes to orient their lives toward. He argued that much of what presents as depression, anxiety, and aggression in modern life is actually the manifestation of this vacuum, the symptom of a life without sufficient meaning. And he noted that one of the primary ways people defend against the anxiety of the existential vacuum is through hyperactivity and distraction, through keeping themselves so busy and so stimulated that the emptiness never has a chance to surface and be examined. The implication is uncomfortable but important. The boredom that most people immediately eliminate may in some cases be the surface symptom of something deeper, a signal that the life being lived lacks sufficient meaning, depth, or authentic self-expression. And by immediately suppressing the symptom, the underlying signal is never heard, and the underlying need is never addressed. This is not to say that every moment of boredom is a profound existential crisis. Most boredom is situational, ordinary, and trivially resolved by finding something more engaging to do. But the reflexive, universal, instantaneous elimination of every moment of understimulation, the absolute refusal to ever sit with boredom for even a few minutes, may be preventing something important from reaching conscious awareness. So what does this mean practically? What should you actually do differently? The research suggests several things. First, the next time you feel bored, try waiting. Not forever, not for hours, just longer than you normally would. Before you reach for your phone, before you find the nearest distraction, give the boredom 5 or 10 minutes. Sit with the discomfort. Notice what arises. The mind will fill the space. It cannot help itself. What it fills the space with is worth paying attention to, because it reflects what your brain considers important when no external agent is setting the agenda. Second, build deliberate, unstructured time into your days. Not relaxation, not scheduled leisure, not passive consumption of entertainment. Unstructured. Time with no agenda, no content, no task. Time where the only thing you're doing is existing and allowing your mind to go wherever it goes. This is not wasted time. This is some of the most cognitively productive time available to you. The researchers who study the default mode network describe it as a time when the brain consolidates learning, integrates experience, and generates the insights that deliberate, focused attention cannot produce. Third, when persistent boredom keeps returning even after you've tried to address it, treat it as data. Ask what it might be pointing to. Is the work genuinely meaningful? Are the relationships genuinely nourishing? Is the life being lived actually aligned with what you care about? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that boredom, in its most important form, is attempting to raise. And a life in which those questions are never raised, because boredom is always immediately eliminated before it can raise them, may be a life in which some of the most important self-knowledge never gets developed. There is something almost paradoxical about the fact that boredom, one of the most universally disliked human experiences, turns out on examination to be one of the most useful. That the feeling everyone tries hardest to escape may be the feeling most worth sitting with. That the restlessness you suppress might be the most important signal your mind sends. Your brain is not malfunctioning when it's bored. It is asking for something. It is pointing towards something that the current situation isn't providing. And unlike most of the signals your body sends, which point toward immediate physical needs, boredom often points towards something harder to name and harder to satisfy. The need for meaning, for depth, for genuine engagement with what actually matters to you. The next time you reach for your phone to make boredom go away, pause for just a moment. Not to torture yourself with it. Not to turn every idle minute into an existential exercise. Just to ask once before you fill the silence, what was I about to hear? Because there's a reasonable chance it was something important. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.